Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is a Medion Erazer P6681 gaming laptop, a catchy name I know, and it cost me £300, roughly $375. Normally a laptop with similar specs would cost in the region of 5, 6 or maybe even 700, so why was this one so cheap? Well, it was for sale over at Laptops Direct under their clearance section, and I just happened to be browsing their site to catch what was one of the last ones in stock. Safe to say, I didn't hesitate, but since clicking the Buy Now button, there's been one thing playing on my mind. See, when you look up the specs of this machine, many product pages state that this has a GTX 1050, but there was absolutely no mention of that in the Laptops Direct listing description. If I was selling one of these, the graphics card would surely be the first thing I'd talk about, so maybe it wasn't working or had been removed, hence the cheap price, which I don't think is even possible, but knowing my luck, I wasn't ruling anything out, especially as I've purchased a laptop from this site before, which only had 4 gigs of RAM opposed to the 8 gigs as was usually standard. So, it arrived today and I was eager to test it and discover what was inside. But first, let's discuss the aesthetics. To start with, it's slightly marked as described. Unlike myself, it's pretty slim and light. Despite its good looks, it's covered in this rubbery texture, similar to the old Alienware I tested a while back, which feels weirdly wet and dry at the same time, and I imagine it would start to easily wear away after years of use. I wouldn't mind if it provided some sort of grip, but it's quite slippery, like a fish. Around the machine, we've got all the usual ports you'd expect to find, as well as a DVD drive, something I'm always happy to see because of my big physical games collection. The keyboard feels very nice and the keys are well spaced, with each one outlined with electric blue styling, possibly to make up for the lack of any lighting effects, a deal breaker for some maybe. So, it was time to turn it on and investigate. The Full HD 15.6 inch screen looks excellent, with a nice deep colour palette, and it's a good job because this will be the first thing you notice. I jumped into the device manager to see if we actually had a GTX 1050 in this thing, which of course wasn't mentioned anywhere in the description, and luckily there it was, listed under the HD 620 integrated graphics. This just makes me wonder why it wasn't mentioned in the first place. A quick look at GPU-Z revealed the GTX 1050 has 4 gigs of VRAM, unlike its 2 gig desktop counterpart, but uses less power. We've also got the Core i5-7200U as described. Initially unbeknown to me, this is evidently a dual-core chip with hyper-threading, clocked at 2.5 GHz with a turbo frequency of 3.1. It's a 15-watt low-power CPU, so it will be interesting to see how it performs a little later on. But first, here is a list of the full specs. So let's talk about the Cinebench R15 result first of all. As you can see here, the i5-7200U performs about the same as an old Intel Core 2 Extreme quad-core processor. In terms of the AMD side of things, well, you're going to experience similar performance to an FX 4300, a chip that can be found for a very decent price these days and could still form the basis of a very cheap budget entry-level gaming machine. As we move on to games though, well, you'll see that the CPU will begin to struggle. I started off with Battlefield 5. Here you can see the GTX 1050 is holding its own quite well, but the i5-7200U is often touching 100% usage and holding the graphics card back quite a bit, even at 1080p with the low settings. I ran all of today's tests at 1080p resolution. However, CSGO ran near flawlessly, low settings once again with 1080p. There will be a few dips here and there, but overall it's going to be a pretty decent experience. Feel free to turn the settings up a little bit with similar specs, but if you want to retain at least 60, then I wouldn't say going any higher than medium would be a good idea. CSGO is obviously more CPU intensive, but it's not maxing the processor out. Now, Fallout 4, despite being a big AAA release, is a couple of years old now, and so runs quite well on this hardware. Here we are in the town of Concord, and you'll retain around 60 frames per second with the low settings once again. The settings could probably be pushed up a little bit higher if 30 FPS is an ideal target, but if you wander off into the wasteland, slightly more demanding areas, you will see a frame drop to around the mid-40s anyway, so perhaps keeping things at low would be the better idea for titles like Fallout 4, open world games that can be quite intensive on a system. Far Cry New Dawn, probably the newest title tested today, also runs okay, 1080p with the low preset once again, and 100% resolution scaling. You'll notice that the 1050, again, like in the past with other games, isn't really being utilised here, whereas the processor is struggling quite a bit. It's not a very fair pairing. Despite the high CPU usage in Overwatch, we were still getting very playable frame rates, albeit once again at 1080p with the low settings. The reason I chose low here is because, just like before, we were seeing a few frame drops when the action started to heat up a little bit. Overall though, you should have a fairly decent experience. In terms of the noise and the heat coming from the machine, well, it's not really any louder than a traditional desktop GPU under stress, and it's certainly quieter than a lot of laptops I've tested in the past. PUBG also ran surprisingly well, 1080p with the very low preset here, nothing changed, resolution scale at 100%, and overall we were having a pretty decent experience. PUBG is more than playable, I'd say, on this system if you keep the settings low enough. Just bear in mind that you probably won't be able to turn things up to medium or high, as the CPU is, once again, already struggling. I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but I'm a little bit disappointed with this processor, and it has no place being paired with this GPU. Finally, Skyrim Special Edition, the remastered version of the 2011 title, also ran quite well. Here I was using the medium preset as the launcher suggested, and I played through the first 20 minutes of the game, which in itself can be quite intensive. There's a lot going on screen, and I found that, yeah, the frame rates were pretty acceptable. So I think overall it did okay, providing you don't set the in-game graphics too high across the board. So this laptop, was it a good deal? Well, I think for the price it was a pretty decent buy, especially considering it was a nice surprise to see the 1050 in this thing after all. However, if you're paying £500, £600 or £700 for a machine like this, then you'll probably be disappointed if you expect to be able to run a lot of titles with high or even medium settings in some instances. Especially these days, you'll often find that a GTX 1050 may be paired with a slightly weaker or low-powered CPU, like the i5-7200U, and it's going to be that that's going to hold you back in a lot of cases. If you're at home most of the time, then a traditional desktop is obviously the way to go. You could build something similar to this laptop, say featuring an FX 4300 and GTX 1050, if you're on a tighter budget, that's going to perform very similar to this, or if not, a little bit better. I think the best bet for laptops, gaming laptops, is to do exactly as I've done here. Look for a great used deal, because then the outlay initially isn't all that much, and for the price you pay, the performance you're getting in return is okay, and I think that's the best way to do it. I can never see the point in going out and purchasing a brand new £700 laptop that features similar specs to this, only to achieve subpar frame rates in some situations. But let's bring it back a little bit to this specific machine. What would I change about it? If you're shopping for a laptop like this, what are some of the things you might want to look out for instead of the specs that we've got in this case? Well, first of all, I'd check that the RAM was upgradable. I think 16 gigs of RAM would help out a little bit more when it comes to tasks like video editing, if you want to do a little bit of that. I also think that perhaps switching the traditional hard disk drive inside one of these to an SSD would be a better idea, even if it's a smaller capacity, and then you use an external hard drive as your backup drive, because it's going to improve your loading times when you first boot into Windows, as well as the loading times in games. Overall though, I think we got a pretty good deal. For the money paid today, we were able to run a few AAA games without much outlay in terms of price. And I'd just like to reiterate that if you are shopping around for gaming laptops, then always consider the used market first of all, but be aware that the warranty may not necessarily be there like it is with new purchases. Putting gaming aside entirely, then this is actually a pretty decent laptop. I mean, the processor itself may only be a dual-core hyper-threaded CPU, which will let you down when it comes to running a few applications, but for everyday general browsing, things like that, you're not going to see much in the way of slowdown. And I think it's a nice low power CPU that helps the laptop maintain a solid battery life as well. Medion as a whole company seem to put out some pretty well priced hardware as far as laptops go. I'm having trouble disconnecting from the whole price to performance thing, because as a PC gamer, I'm always considering what I could get as opposed to what I've got, you know, in terms of how much I spend and the performance that I get back. But I'm going to end there because I'm going to ramble on too much. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like on it, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.